that are involved with these programs. And Darryl Rigney is a long-term colleague. He does a lot of international work at the moment with other First Nations. One of the things that these programs have particularly done is connect into international Indigenous world. So a lot of work's going on around the world by Indigenous people, and Ngarrindjeri are very connected internationally in the US and Canada and New Zealand in particular, so that learning from other spaces has been brought into the Ngarrindjeri context. It's been done through ARC projects, but it's also been done directly through nation-to-nation treaties and other spaces. So Darryl was actually speaking at a meeting in Arizona of First Nations leaders around these sorts of issues and talking about this program last week. Okay, so this one's about cultural knowledge. Now, those first two presentations made the point that the lands and waters are a living body. The Ngarrindjeri people are not separate from the lands and waters. The two go together. They're interconnected. So is knowledge and wisdom, and spirit is all part of that one big mix. So that if you're dealing with taking people's land in 1836 and not negotiating treaties, for instance, and this is an excerpt from the 1836 letters patent that sort of set up South Australia, directly coming from the king of the day. This promise was made to Aboriginal people in South Australia, that nothing in those letters patent contained should affect or construe to affect the rights of any Aboriginal natives of the said province to the actual occupation or enjoyment in their own persons or in the persons of their descendants of any lands therein. So that's descendants as well, now occupied or enjoyed by such natives. So there's a commitment made that Indigenous people's connection to country, use of country, relationship to country should be respected and not alienated. And when you're dealing with issues like cultural knowledge is something that's not separate from land and body. So talking about cultural knowledge, it's embodied knowledge. It comes with cultural responsibility. Now, I'm non-Indigenous, so I'm not speaking from an Indigenous perspective here. I would have liked someone to be standing here with me to be presenting this, but unfortunately I'm the person presenting at the moment, and I'm basing this on my work with people and the words that people have put together. So this is the Ngarrindjeri perspective. These words were put together, for instance, by Uncle Tom and other elders to try to get across that interconnection that exists. So the other thing about cultural knowledge is that cultural wisdom is something that has to be enacted and performed by the right people, so that it can't just be isolated off and taken as something that can be given to someone else who's disconnected from that space to enact. It's actually local, embodied knowledge. The KMY agreement started the process of recognising that in law. And we've got a partner in this presentation, Sean Berg, who's the author of that book at the beginning there, Coming to Terms. He's been instrumental in helping to negotiate some of these contract law agreements around issues like cultural knowledge. And we've published on some of that on the cultural knowledge clause in the Institute of Aboriginal Studies journals. In the partnerships project, what was able to be negotiated was a cultural knowledge protection set of clauses and definitions. There's now a separate cultural knowledge agreement around water planning. Those protections have been included in all of the project agreements and within the actual, project implementation plans as well, or the statement of commitments. In terms of water planning, specifically we have a separate cultural knowledge agreement. The Speaking as Country deed also deals with cultural knowledge. It's saying that Ngarrindjeri people are speaking as country and that cultural knowledge is embedded in country. So if a scientist is talking about the importance of a particular fish species, it's got to be recognised that often from a Ngarrindjeri perspective, they're talking about someone's relations, someone's ancestors, someone's spirit. So there's got to be the ability to speak as and part of that land, or those waters, those living things. And the knowledge is understood as being embedded in the land and in the fish and in the plants. It's passed down by elders as well, but only in particular contexts to people who have the right qualities and the responsibility to take on that knowledge. And for elders, I guess, one of the things I learnt was that talking to elders back in the 1980s, they were having a hard time making a decision to pass on cultural knowledge because they felt that the young people would be disrespected by non-Indigenous people in relation to that cultural knowledge. Because the way they felt was their cultural knowledge and understandings weren't being respected by the general non-Indigenous community. So what is the benefit of passing that on to your children or your grandchildren if it's only going to be difficult for them to actually carry or to try to explain? So there was a real tension over those issues, and that still remains a tension that, you know, knowledge is responsibility. Knowledge is often not the same as other people's knowledge. And if you're living in a place where there are no treaties, that's putting you in a position where you're going to have to negotiate for that knowledge. This is just a definitional part of one of the agreements, one of the earlier ones, just to start to try to name cultural knowledge as something separate from intellectual property. So what Ngarrindjeri worked out was that cultural knowledge doesn't get protected by intellectual property law. You actually have to have separate protection for cultural knowledge. And that's where we have separate clauses, we have separate agreements that deal with cultural knowledge as a separate category.
Can I just add to that, Steve?
Yeah,
so
you've worked with it. So
yeah, so the clause and the definition, you know, it's nice to have it in a legal document and an agreement and give it to someone in the Clean Recovery Project and go, here you go, deal with that. We spent some time working with the NRA to pull together a procedure on how you actually give that life, how you acknowledge and respect the clause and that legal obligation, and provided some upskilling for people so they knew when they went into, say, these working group meetings or they went out onto the islands there to do some ground truthing work, and one of the Ngarrindjeri share with them their cultural knowledge that they know what to do about it, and we've got an agreed process there.
So that cultural knowledge shared in that ground truthing exercise, people were aware that it was being done for the purposes of that project, not to be used in other spaces, and also aware that some members of the group may not be sharing things with the rest of the group because there'd be cultural sensitivities around where it's who's in the group, where you're going, and other issues. So trying to develop up an understanding with people, non-Indigenous people working with Ngarrindjeri people around those issues, which then makes it possible for Ngarrindjeri elders and others to feel a little bit more confident about sharing a key piece of information that might be important to actually explain a key issue, and do a different form of ground truthing from a Ngarrindjeri perspective. Okay, so the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority are the peak body at the moment of the Ngarrindjeri Nation, have been set up. Ngarrindjeri have always had a traditional form of governance called the Tendi. The Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority was set up in around 2007-8. It was developing in that period. So it's not been around a long time, but it's developed up these particular goals. And as you can see, caring for our people, lands and waters and all living things, basically, the things is missing from there, is critical part of what the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority does. And these are the kinds of goals that Ngarrindjeri are looking to secure. All of those goals can be used in that sort of Ngarrindjeri assessment of well-being. So if a project isn't actually building strong culture, if a project isn't supporting Ngarrindjeri as a sovereign First Nation, it's not supporting people's respect for history or regional leadership or building confident people, then that's reducing the well-being of Ngarrindjeri people. So it can be used as a sort of a mechanism for testing whether something. It's a risk management process in a way. Ngarrindjeri assessment is being used to in risk assessment in the water planning process with the Murray-Darling Basin planning process. So state has a risk assessment process, Ngarrindjeri have a risk assessment process, do the policies, the legislations, the plans, secure this goal for the Ngarrindjeri Nation. If they're going to cause problems for it, then there's a mismatch and there's some work to be done. And this is the body that holds the cultural knowledge or tries to look after the cultural knowledge that we're working with. Cultural knowledge is also individually and group, responsibility owned. 1 minute. Okay, I'll move down to this point. This work's been going on for a while, so there are lots of organisations and governments that recognise cultural knowledge and actually included in the agreement. So we're working with multiple universities. Cambridge University and Harvard have been part of projects that have recognised cultural knowledge. ANU does, state government now does, the federal government have recognised Ngarrindjeri cultural knowledge in project agreements. And we work with other nations around Australia. They're just some of them we work on other projects. It also includes internationals, so international universities, Te Papa is involved in projects. The Association of American Indian Affairs is part of a project, and they've actually signed up to a project agreement with cultural knowledge recognised as a separate category. So it's not something that's not being used, it's not scary, and it hasn't meant that projects have stopped and not produced the outcomes that they should produce. So I think that's an important point to make at the end there.
All right. Thanks very much, Steve. 3 in a row, that's a big effort. So join me in what does anybody have some specific questions, or should we just jump? I think we should probably just jump straight into the panel and get all of our presenters